The transport ship Vex Corian shuddered violently as another wave of electromagnetic fury slammed into its hull. I, Commander Zelak of the Andromedan fleet, gripped my command chair with all 4 of my appendages, watching the disaster unfold on the main display. 27 different species were aboard this vessel, all heading to the infamous death world known as Terra Prime for advanced survival training. "What could possibly go wrong?" they said. "It's just a routine exercise," they said. Well, apparently everything could go spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. "Commander!" shrieked Lieutenant Vex 9, her crystalline voice cracking with panic. "The atmospheric processors are failing. We're going down whether we like it or not." I let out a sound that roughly translated to a very inappropriate curse in 17 different galactic languages. The storm below us wasn't just any ordinary weather pattern. No, this was what the locals cheerfully called a Category 7 hyperstorm. Because apparently, the humans had decided that regular storms weren't entertaining enough, so they had to create weather systems that could probably destroy small moons. "All hands, prepare for emergency landing protocols," I barked into the communications array. "And may the 7 suns have mercy on our souls, because this planet certainly won't." The ship bucked and twisted like a wounded space whale as we plummeted through layers of churning atmospheric violence. Rain hammered against our viewports with the intensity of liquid bullets, while lightning bolts the size of plasma cannons lit up the sky in terrifying displays of raw power. Through the chaos, I could see the surface approaching at an alarming rate. Just one thing before we begin. YouTube tells me 94.3% of you watching aren't subscribed. Subscribing is free. It really supports the channel, and you'll get more amazing HFY sci-fi stories delivered straight to you. Don't miss out. Trees. Massive, towering trees that stretched up like the fingers of some ancient god, reaching desperately toward the stars. The forest below looked dense enough to hide entire civilizations, and knowing Earth's reputation, it probably did. "Impact in 30 seconds, Vex 9 announced, her voice now reaching frequencies that made my hearing organs ache. "All passengers, assume crash positions and pray to whatever deities you worship." The landing was about as graceful as a drunk Thurlonian trying to dance ballet. We hit the canopy with a sound that could probably be heard from orbit, branches snapping and cracking as our ship carved a path of destruction through the forest. Metal screamed against wood, sparks flew in every direction, and several of my crew members made sounds I hadn't known their species were capable of producing. When the ship finally came to rest, wrapped around what appeared to be a tree trunk the size of a small building, the silence was almost more terrifying than the crash itself. Then the emergency systems kicked in, bathing everything in that lovely shade of panic-inducing red light. "Damage report," I called out, pulling myself from my chair and checking for broken bones. Amazingly, I seemed to be intact, though my dignity had definitely seen better days. "Hull breach in sections 4 through 12, reported Chief Engineer Moltax, his multiple eyes spinning in different directions as he consulted his instruments. "Life support is failing. Communications are down, and the food replicators are somehow now producing nothing but earth beverage called coffee." Coffee. Of all the things to malfunction into, it had to be coffee. The humans' liquid addiction that allegedly kept them functioning despite being made of chemicals that would kill most other species. "What about the passengers?" I asked, dreading the answer. That's the interesting part, Commander," Vex 9 said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We have 17 different species aboard, ranging from the mighty Coraxians to the delicate Crystallis. Everyone's accounted for, but She paused dramatically. There's also one human. One human. One single solitary member of the species that had somehow managed to turn a death world into a garden paradise, who regularly did things that made seasoned galactic warriors wake up in cold sweats, who thought that climbing mountains without oxygen was a fun weekend activity. Just one? I asked, hoping I had misheard. Cadet Marcus Finley, she confirmed, reading from her tablet. 22 Earth years old, fresh out of basic training, volunteered for this mission because, and I quote, "It sounded like fun." Because of course it sounded like fun to a human. Probably the same way jumping into active volcanoes sounded like a relaxing spa day to them. Where is he now? I asked, already knowing I wasn't going to like the answer. That's the problem, sir, Moltax chimed in, his voice carrying that special tone that engineers used when they were about to deliver particularly bad news. He was in Section 7 when we crashed. That section, well, let's just say it's no longer attached to the rest of the ship. Through the shattered viewport, I could see pieces of our vessel scattered across the forest floor, like the universe's most expensive confetti. Section 7 was probably somewhere out there in that maze of trees, assuming it hadn't been completely pulverized on impact. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse, as if the planet itself was personally offended by our presence. Lightning continued to dance between the branches, and the wind howled with a sound that reminded me uncomfortably of the death songs of the Wraith Nebula. "Commander," Vex 9 said quietly, "what are our chances of survival?" I looked around at the assembled group. 17 different species, each evolved on different worlds, each with different environmental needs. The Coraxians needed high-pressure atmospheres, the Zephyrians required specific humidity levels, and the Thermoids literally couldn't survive without artificial heating units. On this world, in this storm, with our life support failing. Honestly, I said, deciding that sugarcoating the truth would be insulting to their intelligence. We're all probably going to die horribly. A collective groan went up from the assembled aliens, followed by various sounds of despair in at least 12 different languages. But, I continued, raising my voice over the din, we're not going to make it easy for this planet. We're going to fight for every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of existence. Because we are members of the Galactic Alliance, and we do not go quietly into the void. It was a good speech. Really, it was. Inspiring, motivational, the kind of thing that got carved into memorial statues. Too bad none of us actually believed we had a chance. That was when the first tree fell. The sound was like thunder, but worse. Deeper, more personal somehow. Through the broken viewports, we watched in horror as one of the massive forest giants came crashing down, its trunk easily 3 times the diameter of our ship. It hit the ground with an impact that shook our already damaged vessel, sending more sparks flying from the failing electrical systems. "That's not good," observed Vex 9, in what was probably the understatement of the century. More trees began to fall, pushed over by winds that had to be moving at speeds that defied several laws of physics. Each impact sent shock waves through the ground, and our ship groaned and creaked ominously with every tremor. "The hull can't take much more of this," Moltax reported, his voice barely audible over the cacophony outside. "If we don't find better shelter soon—" He didn't need to finish. We all knew what happened when spacecraft hulls failed on hostile worlds. It was the kind of thing that got discussed in hushed tones at the Academy, usually followed by a moment of respectful silence for the crews who didn't make it home. That was when Corax Prime, our resident expert on survival situations, made his assessment. "Friends," he said in his deep, rumbling voice, "I have analyzed our situation using advanced tactical algorithms, environmental data, and statistical probability matrices." He paused for effect, his massive frame casting shadows in the emergency lighting. "We are, as the humans would say, completely and utterly screwed." The Caraxians were known for their brutal honesty. It was one of their more endearing qualities, assuming you enjoyed having your hopes crushed with scientific precision. "How long do we have?" I asked. "Assuming the hull holds, the life support continues to function at minimal capacity, and no more trees decide to use our ship as a landing pad?" Corax Prime consulted his instruments again. "Approximately 6 hours. 6 hours. Not even enough time to compose proper death songs, let alone figure out a way to survive on a world that was actively trying to kill everything that wasn't native to it." "What about the human?" asked Dr. Cynthia, our medical officer. Her serpentine features were twisted with concern. "Shouldn't we attempt a rescue mission?" "Into that?" I gestured toward the viewport, where the storm continued to rage with undiminished fury. "That's not a rescue mission. That's elaborate suicide. Besides, he's probably already—" I couldn't finish the sentence. Not because I was overcome with emotion, you understand, but because even thinking about what that storm could do to someone caught outside was enough to make my digestive systems rebel. "Actually," Vex 9 said, studying her scanner readings, "I'm picking up a faint life signature approximately 400 meters northeast of our position." We all stared at her in stunned silence. "You're saying he's alive?" I asked, not daring to hope. "Not just alive," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "The readings suggest he's comfortable." Comfortable? A human was comfortable in the middle of a storm that was systematically destroying a forest full of trees that had stood for centuries. A storm that had turned our advanced spacecraft into scrap metal and left 17 different alien species huddled together like frightened younglings. "That's impossible," declared Corax Prime. "No biological entity could survive in those conditions without proper shelter, heating, and atmospheric protection." "Well," I said, watching another tree crash down outside, "apparently nobody told the human that." The next few hours passed with agonizing slowness. Our life support systems continued to fail, bit by bit. The temperature inside the ship dropped steadily as our heating units gave up the fight against the storm's fury. Several species began showing signs of hypothermia, despite their environmental suits. Dr. Cynthia did her best to keep everyone stable, but her medical supplies were limited, and our replicators were still stuck on that endless coffee cycle. Apparently, the universe had a sense of humor after all. "Commander," Moltax reported during one of his regular status updates, "I've managed to boost the scanner range. The human's life signs are still strong, and he appears to be moving around." "Moving around?" I repeated. "In this storm?" "The readings are consistent with someone who is not only mobile but possibly engaged in some form of construction activity." Construction activity. While we were slowly freezing to death in our high-tech survival suits, the human was apparently redecorating the forest. "This is madness," muttered Vex 9. "No species should be able to function in those conditions." "Unless," Corax Prime said thoughtfully, "the stories are true." We all turned to look at him. The Caraxians were known for collecting data on every species in the galaxy, especially the dangerous ones. If anyone would know about human capabilities, it would be him. "What stories?" I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to know. The tales speak of humans who have survived in conditions that would kill most other species instantly, he said, his voice taking on the tone of someone recounting ancient legends. Humans who have walked through fire, swum in frozen oceans, and built shelters from nothing but debris and determination. Those are just myths, Doctor, Cynthia protested. Propaganda spread by their military to intimidate potential enemies. Are they? Corax Prime asked. Consider this. Humans evolved on a world where the weather changes violently without warning, where storms can level entire cities, where the very ground sometimes opens up and swallows buildings whole. They adapted to survive in conditions that most species would consider apocalyptic. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault. Another tree fell, this one close enough that we could see the massive root system as it tore free from the earth. Yet somewhere out there, according to our instruments, one human was not just surviving, but apparently thriving. Sir, Vex 9 said quietly, life support is down to critical levels. We have maybe 2 hours left before we start losing crew members. 2 hours. I looked around at the faces of my crew, all different species, all far from home, all trusting me to find a solution to an impossible situation. The irony wasn't lost on me. We were supposedly the advanced civilizations, with our technology and our ships and our careful environmental controls. Yet here we were, helpless in the face of natural forces that one primitive human was weathering without apparent difficulty. Commander, Dr. Cynthia said suddenly, I'm reading something unusual on the medical scanners. Define unusual, I said, wondering what fresh horror the universe had decided to throw at us. The human's bio-readings, she said, studying her instruments with professional fascination. His heart rate is elevated, but not from stress or exertion. His body temperature is stable, his breathing is regular, and his brain activity suggests— She paused, staring at the scanner as if it had just told her that gravity was optional. Suggests what? I prompted. It suggests he's enjoying himself. Silence fell over the group like a heavy blanket. Outside, the storm raged on, tearing apart a forest that had stood since before most of our civilizations had discovered fire. Our ship was slowly dying around us. Our life support was failing, and we were all facing the very real possibility of becoming part of this world's ecosystem in a very permanent way. And somewhere out there, a human was having fun. That settles it, I said, making a decision that I knew would either save us all or kill us all a little faster. We need to reach that human. Sir? Vex 9 asked, her voice climbing several octaves. You're suggesting we go out there? Into that storm? I'm suggesting that right now, that human represents our best chance of survival, I replied. Whatever he's doing to stay alive out there, we need to learn how to do it too. But the distance, Moltax began. 400 meters, I finished. In clear weather, that's a pleasant walk. In this storm, it might as well be 400 kilometers, but if we stay here, we die anyway. At least this way, we die trying. It wasn't the most inspiring speech I'd ever given, but it had the advantage of being brutally honest. Sometimes, that was all you could offer. The plan, such as it was simple. We would wait for a brief lull in the storm, then make our way toward the human's position using our emergency beacon as a guide. We would travel in groups, with the strongest helping the weakest, and we would pray to whatever deities were listening that we didn't become forest fertilizer before we reached our destination. What could possibly go wrong with a plan like that? As if the universe had heard my thoughts and decided to answer that question, The ship suddenly lurched to one side with a grinding screech of metal against wood. Through the viewport, we could see that another tree had fallen, and this one had landed directly across our hull. "Hull breach in Section 3!" Moltax shouted over the alarms that had suddenly decided to join the symphony of destruction. "Emergency bulkheads are sealing, but we're losing atmosphere fast." And that, as they say, was that. Our decision had been made for us. We could stay and suffocate, or we could venture out into the storm and take our chances with the elements. I activated the emergency communications system, broadcasting on all frequencies. "Attention, Cadet Finley," I said, hoping against hope that somehow our signal would reach him through the electromagnetic interference. "This is Commander Zilak of the Vexkorian. If you can hear this message, 17 members of your galactic family are about to attempt to reach your position. We could really use some of that famous human ingenuity right about now." There was no response, of course. The storm was jamming everything, and even if it wasn't, our communications array was probably scattered across several square kilometers of forest floor by now. "All right, everyone," I announced, looking at the assembled group of aliens who were all staring at me like I had just suggested we try to negotiate with a black hole. "Time to see what we're really made of." As we prepared for what was quite possibly the last journey any of us would ever make, I couldn't help but wonder about that human out there in the storm. What was he doing that we weren't? What did he know that we didn't? And most importantly, would any of us live long enough to find out? The storm howled its answer, and somehow, I didn't think we were going to like what it had to say. The moment we stepped outside the failing ship, I understood why evolution had been particularly cruel to species that hadn't originated on death worlds. The wind hit us like a physical wall, sending Vex 9 tumbling backward into Moltax's arms. Rain pelted down with such force that it felt like being attacked by liquid projectiles, and the lightning turned night into day every few seconds with displays that would have made our best weapons engineers weep with envy. "Stay together!" I shouted, though I doubted anyone could hear me over the roar of nature having what appeared to be a complete mental breakdown. "Follow the beacon!" Our emergency beacon was supposed to guide us toward the humans' position, but apparently nobody had told the storm about our navigation plans. The device kept spinning wildly, its readings jumping between different directions as electromagnetic interference played havoc with its sensors. Dr. Cynthia, bless her serpentine heart, was trying to keep our most vulnerable crew members upright. The Zephyrians were having particular trouble, their lightweight frames making them about as stable as leaves in a hurricane, which, considering the circumstances, was probably an accurate comparison. We had covered maybe 50 meters when the first real disaster struck. Well, the second real disaster, if you counted the whole crashing on a death world during a superstorm incident as the first one. Lieutenant Corville, one of our thermoid crew members, suddenly collapsed. His environmental suit had been damaged during the crash, and his internal heating systems couldn't cope with the rapidly dropping temperature. In the few seconds it took us to notice his distress, his core temperature had plummeted to dangerous levels. "We have to get him warm!" Dr. Cynthia shouted, her medical training overriding the obvious fact that we were in the middle of a forest that was systematically destroying itself around us. "With what?" I asked, gesturing helplessly at our surroundings. "In case you hadn't noticed, we're not exactly equipped for outdoor camping on a world where the weather is actively trying to murder us." That was when we heard it, a sound that cut through the storm like a blade through silk. Someone was whistling. Not just any whistling, mind you. This was a cheerful, almost jaunty tune that suggested its creator was having the time of his life. The melody was completely at odds with our current situation, like hearing elevator music during a space battle. "Is that?" Vex 9 began, her voice trailing off in disbelief. "The human," I finished, feeling a mixture of hope and irritation that probably wasn't entirely healthy. "He's whistling. In a storm that's turning trees into toothpicks, he's whistling." Following the sound, we struggled through the undergrowth, our progress measured in meters rather than kilometers. Every step was a battle against wind that seemed determined to relocate us to different zip codes. Branches whipped through the air like organic weapons, and more than once we had to dodge falling debris that would have turned us into very flat aliens. The whistling grew louder as we approached, joined by what sounded like someone having a conversation with themselves. Not the kind of conversation that suggested mental instability, but rather the kind that indicated someone was genuinely enjoying their work. "Hand me that branch there." "No, the bigger one." "Perfect. Now, if I just angle this correctly." There we go. We pushed through a curtain of hanging vines and stopped dead in our tracks. There, in a clearing that couldn't have been more than 20 meters across, stood what could only be described as the most ridiculous shelter any of us had ever seen. It wasn't built around a tree, it was built inside a tree. Someone had somehow hollowed out a massive trunk that had to be at least 8 meters in diameter, creating a multi-level living space, complete with windows, a door, and what appeared to be a functional chimney. And standing in the doorway, completely dry and apparently unharmed, was Cadet Marcus Finley. He was a typical human specimen, as far as I could tell. Medium height, brown hair that looked like it hadn't seen a proper grooming device in weeks, and wearing what appeared to be standard-issue survival gear that had been modified in ways that would probably violate several safety regulations. He had somehow fashioned additional protection from materials that looked suspiciously like parts of our crashed ship. "Oh, hey there!" he called out cheerfully, waving at us as if we were neighbors dropping by for a casual visit. "You guys look like you could use some shelter. Come on in, I just got the fireplace working." Fireplace! He had built a fireplace inside a living tree, in the middle of a storm that was busy rearranging the local geography. We stumbled toward the shelter like refugees, which, technically speaking, we were. The moment we stepped through the door, the noise of the storm dropped to a manageable level, replaced by the crackling of a fire and the sound of wind passing around the structure rather than through it. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Marcus had somehow carved out multiple levels connected by a spiral staircase that followed the natural curve of the tree's interior. The walls were smooth and even, lined with what looked like a mixture of sap and clay that had hardened into an effective sealant. Windows had been cut at strategic points and covered with a transparent material that I couldn't immediately identify. "How did you—" I started, then realized I didn't even know what question to ask first. "Oh, the tree was already mostly hollow," Marcus explained casually, hanging up what appeared to be a collection of tools he had fashioned from crashed debris. "Probably struck by lightning years ago and never quite recovered. I just had to clean it out and make some improvements. The sap makes excellent waterproofing once you heat it up and mix in some clay." "You did all this in 6 hours?" Dr. Cynthia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 6 hours? Marcus laughed, a sound that was somehow more warming than the fire crackling in the improvised hearth. "I've been working on this for about 2 hours. Spent the first hour just exploring and figuring out what materials I had to work with. 2 hours. In 2 hours, while we had been slowly dying inside our advanced spacecraft, this human had built what amounted to a luxury survival shelter using nothing but debris and apparently sheer bloody-minded determination." "The thermoid!" Dr. Cynthia suddenly exclaimed, remembering our injured crew member. "Already on it," Marcus said, guiding Corval toward the fire. "Hypothermia, right?" "Been there myself. The trick is gradual warming and warm liquids. I've got some pine needle tea brewing that should help." Pine needle tea. The human was serving pine needle tea. "Is it safe to drink?" Dr. Cynthia asked hesitantly. "For most species, yeah," Marcus replied, checking something that looked like a rough chart he had drawn on a piece of bark. "I did a quick analysis of everybody's basic physiology using the data from your medical scanner. Had to improvise the scanner bit, but the ship's computer core was still functional when I found it." "You found the computer core?" Moltax asked, his multiple eyes widening in surprise. "About 300 meters that way," Marcus said, pointing through one of his improvised windows. It was buried under a pile of branches, but the data storage unit was intact. "Downloaded everything I could about galactic biology before the power cell died." Before the power cell died. He had prioritized learning about alien biology over trying to call for rescue. The implications of that were either very reassuring or deeply terrifying, depending on how you looked at it. "But how did you know we would find you?" Vex 9 asked. Marcus grinned, and there was something in that expression that reminded me why humans had such a reputation throughout the galaxy. It wasn't malice exactly, but it was the look of someone who had seen impossible odds and decided they were merely inconvenient. "I didn't," he said simply. "But I figured if anyone survived the crash, they'd eventually need better shelter than a damaged ship. So I built something that could house everyone and waited to see who would show up." Everyone. He had built shelter for everyone, not knowing if we were alive, not knowing if we would find him, not even knowing if we would want his help. He had simply identified a problem and solved it, because that was apparently what humans did when faced with impossible situations. "The storm," Corax Prime rumbled, speaking for the first time since we had arrived. "How are you protecting the shelter from the storm?" "Oh, that," Marcus said, as if weathering a tempest that could level cities was a minor detail. "The tree's root system goes down about 40 meters and spreads out over a huge area. It's basically anchored to bedrock. Plus, I reinforced the weak points with some metal struts from the ship and sealed everything with heated sap. This thing could probably survive a direct meteor strike. He had built a shelter that could survive meteor strikes using tree sap and scrap metal. Over the next few hours, as the storm continued to rage outside, we learned more about human ingenuity than most species discover in decades of academic study. Marcus had not only built shelter, he had created a complete survival infrastructure. He had rigged up a water collection and filtration system using pieces of the ship's atmospheric processors. He had established food storage areas stocked with edible plants he had identified and gathered during brief lulls in the storm. He had even created sleeping areas customized for different species' needs, based on his quick study of our biological requirements. "The Zephyrians need higher humidity," he explained, showing us a section where he had installed a small waterfall feature made from recycled ship components. "The Caraxians prefer firm sleeping surfaces, so I built them stone platforms. And the Crystallis need very specific light wavelengths for proper rest, so I ground up some of the ship's optical crystals and embedded them in the ceiling." Each modification was simple, practical, and showed a level of consideration for alien needs that put most diplomatic protocols to shame. This wasn't just survival, it was hospitality on a level that would make luxury hotels envious. "Marcus," I said, settling down near the fire as the warmth slowly returned sensation to my extremities. Why did you volunteer for this mission?" He was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames as if they held answers to questions he hadn't quite figured out how to ask yet. "Honestly," he said finally, "because everyone said it was impossible. They said no one could survive on Terra Prime during storm season, that the environment was too harsh, the conditions too extreme, and I thought, well, that sounds like exactly the kind of challenge my species was designed for. As if humans had been specifically engineered to thrive in conditions that would kill everything else in the galaxy. Your species terrifies most of the other races, Doctor," Cynthia observed quietly. "I know," Marcus said, not sounding particularly bothered by this fact. "But here's the thing. We don't try to be scary. We just try to survive. And apparently, we're really, really good at it." Outside, the storm began to show signs of finally exhausting itself. The lightning became less frequent. The wind died down from apocalyptic to merely severe, and the rain shifted from liquid bullets to simple torrential downpour. "How long do these storms typically last?" Vex 9 asked. "According to the planetary database," Marcus replied, consulting his bark chart again, "anywhere from 8 to 72 hours. This one's been going for about 11 hours, so we've got some time yet." Some time yet. He was planning for the possibility of being trapped here for days, and he seemed genuinely unconcerned about the prospect. "What happens when the storm ends?" I asked. "Well," Marcus said, settling back against the curved wall of his impossible shelter, "I figured we'd wait for rescue. But if rescue doesn't come, I've identified several locations where we could establish a more permanent base. There's a cave system about 5 kilometers north that would be perfect for long-term habitation, and the local ecosystem is rich enough to support a decent-sized population." Long-term habitation. He was already making plans for the possibility that we might never leave this world, and instead of despair, his voice carried a note of anticipation, as if the challenge of building a civilization from scratch was just another interesting problem to solve. That was when I finally understood what made humans so dangerous. It wasn't their technology, though that was impressive. It wasn't their military might, though that was formidable. It was their attitude toward impossible situations. Where other species saw insurmountable obstacles, humans saw interesting puzzles. Where others saw certain death, humans saw temporary inconvenience. They didn't just adapt to harsh environments, they thrived in them, turned them into homes, made them better than they were before. "Cadet Finley," I said formally, using his rank for the first time since we had met. "Yes, sir?" "When we get back to civilization, assuming we get back to civilization, I'm recommending you for the Galactic Medal of Exceptional Ingenuity." He looked genuinely surprised. "Sir, I haven't done anything exceptional. I just did what needed to be done." And there it was. The most terrifying thing about humans wasn't their capability. It was their perspective. What they considered routine problem-solving, the rest of the galaxy considered miraculous survival skills. The storm finally began to break as dawn approached. Though calling it dawn on a world where the sky had been black with clouds for hours was somewhat optimistic. Gradually, patches of actual sky became visible between the churning masses of vapor, and the wind dropped from tree-destroying to merely very inconvenient. "I think the worst of it is passing," Marcus announced, checking the crude but apparently accurate weather monitoring system he had rigged up near one of the windows. "What's our next move?" I asked. "We wait for rescue," he said simply. "I've been sending out a distress signal using parts from the communications array. It's not much, but it should be enough to guide any search teams to our location." And if rescue doesn't come? Marcus smiled that terrifying human smile again. Then we build something better. This world has everything we need to establish a permanent colony. Good water, abundant plant life, plenty of raw materials. In a year or two, we could have a thriving settlement here. A thriving settlement. On a world that had nearly killed all of us in the span of a few hours, he was talking about building a thriving settlement. 3 days later, when the rescue ships finally arrived, they found us healthy, well-fed, and living in what their reports would later describe as an engineering marvel constructed from indigenous materials and salvaged spacecraft components. The rescue team's leader, a veteran Andromedan captain with decades of experience, took one look at Marcus's tree shelter and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "How the hell did you do this?" Marcus shrugged, that same casual gesture that had characterized his entire approach to our impossible situation. "I just did what humans do," he said. "I survived." The rescue captain stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "No wonder your species has such a reputation in the galaxy." As we prepared to leave the world that had nearly been our tomb, I found myself looking back at the tree that had become our salvation. It stood there in the forest, its improvised windows and doors making it look like something from a children's fairy tale. A reminder that sometimes the difference between disaster and adventure was nothing more than perspective and a willingness to turn problems into solutions. "Commander," Marcus said as we boarded the rescue ship, "mind if I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think they'll let me come back here someday?" I had some ideas for improving the shelter design, maybe setting up a proper research station. This world has incredible potential once you know how to work with it instead of against it. I looked at him, this young human who had turned our nightmare into his dream project, and realized that somewhere along the way, the galaxy had produced a species that didn't just refuse to give up. They turned giving up into an impossibility. "Cadet Finley," I said, "I have a feeling that wherever you end up, you'll find a way to make it work." He grinned. "That's what we do, sir. We make it work." And as our rescue ship lifted off from the world that had tested us all and found only one of us truly ready for the challenge, I couldn't help but think that the rest of the galaxy had better prepare itself. Because humanity wasn't just surviving out there among the stars, they were making it work.